has anyone ever been successful at it? And I was like, well, there was a guy named Phil Jackson, right? You may have heard of him.
Today on the sideline, mental performance coach, author, educator, and podcast host Greg Graber is up next. Welcome back to the Fifth Quarter Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Adams, and this is where we dive deep into the world of sports, talking with retired athletes, current athletes, and everyone that makes the sports world work. Before we dive into the show today, I want to send a big thank you to CVic13333, who left this recent review on Apple. Always enjoy this podcast from the very beginning, talking to former athletes starting their fifth quarter to talking to current coaches of the Memphis Tigers, and now a wide variety of guests. The podcast is entertaining, educational, and thought-provoking. Chris, thank you for those kind words. Now, grab your iced tea or your coffee. Get ready to be motivated and inspired because this is where the real stories are told. Today on the sideline, we're back in Memphis. I couldn't be more excited to invite to the show Greg Graber, mental performance coach, author, educator, and podcast host. Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
You are quite welcome. I always like to start off with telling people how we know each other. And we actually, I think, know each other through a good friend of yours and your co-host on the podcast, which is Pete Pranica. And Pete is in episode, I can't remember, I think it's 57. So if you have a chance, check out Pete's podcast episode with me. Actually, no, it's podcast 56. So I just found my notes. We're just fly by the seat of our pants here on the show. I do a little bit of scripting, but not a lot.
But speaking of scripting, yeah, I'm nothing like Pete. So I don't have notes and charts and figures and graphs. So he's kind of Bert and I'm Ernie. So, you get what you get, right?
Hey, I love those kind. It makes it a little bit more fun. So let's start off. You've got this fascinating career as a mental performance coach, working with elite athletes and coaches. So take us back. Was there a moment or an experience that first sparked your interest in the mental side of sports?
So I was always an athlete as a kid. I played college soccer, and then later on as an adult, I ran ultra marathons. That's probably why I'm having a series of surgeries coming up soon on my hips and knees and Achilles and all this stuff. But the middle side of it always fascinated me for some reason. Even when I was like in middle school, I had no idea what like sports psychology was or mental performance. But for some reason, I always knew that it was somewhat or could be somewhat of a difference maker in
Right.
terms of performance.
Okay. And, I always also like to say, if somebody could ask right now, like, who is Greg Graber? How would you answer that?
That's a tough question. I do a lot of different things. I'm an educator by trade.
Mm-hmm.
I was a teacher and a coach and a principal. My background is in educational psychology. So I started working with teams and high level athletes. I still work at Lausanne Collegiate School here in Memphis as the director of social and emotional learning. They give me a lot of latitude to work with these different teams over the country. I'm really into mindfulness. I wrote a book on mindfulness. It was an Amazon bestseller called Slow Your Roll, Mindfulness for Fast Times. I'm a jack of all trades, sort of master of nothing, I guess.
You know,
Um,
I kind of relate to that as well.
yeah, I like to say I have a composite career.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm aimless or I lack focus. It's just different things that are seemingly related really sort of captivate my attention. Um, and that's kind of who I am.
I've discovered that about myself as well. A lot of times people will say, well, you do a lot of stuff. Well, I don't do it all at the same time. And
Yeah.
I can actually relate everything to each other. You talked about I had learned that you did play sports in college, and I had thought about having you on as a retired athlete, but I decided that I think this subject is and this side of you is a little bit more relevant to the podcast just because of the subject matter. How did you get into, like, when you went to college, what was your
Yeah.
degree when you first started?
So my bachelor's degrees were in sociology and English.
Okay.
So I went to a small, tiny liberal arts college in Northeast Georgia called Piedmont College, where I played soccer. Back then, back in the ancient Stone Age, soccer in this country wasn't that popular. You didn't have a lot of big time programs. The ones that you did, they're probably on either coast. So, and I was a small school type person. You
Right.
know, you're either a big school type person or a small school type person. Um, so I started as an assistant with the men's team when I graduated, and I was a sports information director at a bachelor's in sociology.
Mm.
Really interesting at cocktail parties with that degree, but it's like, how am I going to make a living? What am I going to do?
Yeah.
I like coaching. I like teaching. I always like writing in English and reading and literature. Went back, got a bachelor's in English, then eventually got a master's in education.
Mm.
And my primary interest was educational psychology. So kind of fell into it that way. So I spent my early career years as an English teacher, as a soccer coach, high school soccer coach, club soccer coach, college coach for a few years, then kind of morphed into I wanted a little bit more money, still wanted to
Yes.
stay in education. So I became a principal here at Lausanne, where I've been, I think this is year 21. I love this place.
Right.
Um, and then the consulting really started taking off. So I became our director of social and emotional learning, where I could also still do the consulting. So
So, your first consulting job, were you actually pushing yourself, or did somebody just reach out to you and said, "Hey, we'd love for you to come here"?
So it's interesting as a principal, or really as an education or administrator, as you know, as I got you to speak before, I always get interesting people, leaders in the community to come and speak. So when Josh Pastner started off, when Calipari left
Yeah.
Memphis basketball and Josh became the coach, we sort of fostered a relationship, a friendship together because he was always nice enough to come and speak to my students here at Lausanne.
Right.
And I was, and I still am really into mindfulness. And I cornered them one day and I said, Josh, I'd really like to work with your team. And back then, teams weren't really doing this that much.
Mm.
So he goes, well, who does this? Has anyone ever been successful at it? And I was like, well, there's a guy named Phil Jackson, right? You may have heard of him.
Yeah.
The Chicago Bulls. He had a guy named George Mumford, who was a teacher of mine,
Right.
who was into this stuff, and they had a lot of success. So, to make a long story short, I came out. I did a practice with Josh's guys. That was when he had those All Americans on the team, really strong team. It's like Shaq Goodwin, Austin Nichols,
Yeah.
Joe Jackson was probably my first star pupil. Later on, it was like Avery Woodson, Markel, Crawford, those guys. Um, and they kind of laughed it off at first. And I'm like, Josh, this was terrible. You guys aren't into it. He's like, no, I believe in it. I don't want you to quit. Let's keep doing this. We'll make it work. And to Josh's credit, it's really sort of humbling and empowering when someone like Josh has faith in what you're doing and he sees that he can be successful
Right.
and really implores you to keep doing it. So started working with Joe Jackson a lot, Austin Nichols, Trey Draper, all those guys had a lot of success. And it turns into one of those things. One coach knows another coach, knows another coach. Started working with the Grizzlies. Will Wade was at UT Chattanooga then. He has since been very successful at VCU and LSU McNeese. He's always brought me along.
Right.
You know, I've worked with Marquette, Texas, LSU. It's really been cool traveling around, getting to do this, visit these different college campuses, work with these programs and these athletes. It's been a lot of fun.
So the feedback from them, I would imagine that some of the athletes are not as receptive when they hear, especially if they've never worked with you before, that they're not as receptive when you come in. Is there a specific, you don't have to give names, but is there a specific player who gave you feedback later that said how it helped them?
Quite a few. I don't just work with basketball, but being from Memphis and basketball is so huge here
Right.
with the Tigers and the Grizzlies. Basketball became my niche because of that. But I've worked with college golfers, soccer players, you name it. And I have gotten that. They'll be like, I really thought that was a bunch of, but you know what, when you were doing it, I was afraid it was going to be touchy feely, but it's really given me some real great life skills that I've been able to implement into my work life
Right.
as a professional, also in my family life. So it's really rewarding that way. And to answer your question, initially, a lot of guys back in the early days, were really kind of standoffish because it's not as popular as it is now.
Right.
Especially, I teach it from a mindfulness perspective. So I don't really get into the psychological aspects. I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I'll assure them when I'm giving them the sales pitch at the beginning, because it is that to get their buy-in. I'm like, we won't talk about your feelings. I'm not a counselor or a therapist. I'm going to teach you how to focus, how to cultivate mental toughness,
Right.
how to breathe before free throws, how to do mental imagery, these type of tools. It's going to make you a better basketball player. And then they're like, okay, they'll do anything to be a better basketball player typically.
There they will.
And then the cool sort of byproduct that they don't see on the front end is it's going to make them more successful human beings. It's really good for their all around mental wellness.
No,
So.
I agree. So coming from your background as an educator, how did that shape the way you approach the coaching aspect with athletes?
Yeah, I've always been a teacher and a coach, so it was pretty seamless for me. And that's the way I introduce it to them. A lot of them will call me Coach Graber or Coach G or whatever. I'm like, I'm a teacher. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to give you a toolbox of mental performance skills, and you can pull them out and use them when you need to. And it's going to be a real difference maker with your game. I'm like, okay, cool. And it's going to help you with your schoolwork too, if you learn how to focus and concentrate. And oh, wow, okay. So my approach has always been as, I'm a teacher and a coach.
Okay. When you step into a locker room, what's the first thing you aim to understand about the team you're working with? Is there a specific atmosphere or energy that you're looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question because every culture and climate of a team is different, and it all goes back to the coach. I've had athletic directors bring me in before, and coaches have begrudgingly agreed to do it. It never goes well then if the coach doesn't buy in.
That's right.
So typically my connection is with the head coach. And the basketball world is pretty small, really. So if I ever want to get in touch with a coach, I probably know someone who knows that coach, another coach. So if I want to solicit them or work with them, it's never an issue to get their number. Might be an issue to get them to answer my call sometimes, but it's never hard to get in touch with them. But it always looks different. So typically before I go on a consult with a team, let's say I'm working with an LSU or a Marquette, a bigger school, I'll fly in once a month and work with them for a couple of days. So typically there'll be a team session or two, and then there'll be an individual session with every player. But before I set up these visits or these consults, typically I'll talk with the coaches quite a bit and sort of do what I call is sort of like a forensic analysis and learn sort of the culture and the climate of the team, what their needs are, what their wants are, what their issues are. We'll talk about every player on the roster, what their issues are, what their needs are, what their potential is, all that kind of stuff. So it looks a little bit different everywhere. I've got some teams that I work with, and they're like, we just want to bring you in to work with impact players. Maybe 6 or 8 of our basketball players who are going to play.
Right.
Other ones are like, we just want to bring you in once or twice and do a couple of team sessions. So it looks different for every team. But for the greatest impact, it's important to work with them as often as you can, really. Okay. And I do a lot of corporate stuff too. Like Friday, I'm giving a keynote to the Memphis Bar
I
Association.
saw that.
So the way I see it, lawyers are no different than basketball players. They want to perform at a peak level as well. And it's really the same skill set. Obviously, they're not going to learn how to breathe before a free throw, but they may learn how to breathe to lower their heart rate and their blood pressure before they go in the courtroom.
Well,
So the skills are applicable whether you're an athlete, student, corporate executive type, whatever. So
no, I agree with that because, even when I do these podcasts, even though they're pre-recorded, I still feel like I have to change my mindset into I'm about to perform and I have to make sure everything's going on. And anytime I speak, I do the breathing exercise and I try to calm down and just focus on what I'm going to do and not let your emotions, get in with you. So let's talk about the University of Memphis Tigers. And I'm not going to get into specifics or anything, but working with them, especially because they're local, must be a unique experience. And I believe you grew up here, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I went to boarding school. I went to a place called Mindfulness Academy. Being a soccer player, real strong sports program. Typically, they won the national. I got to brag on them now that you got me started. They won the national.
Go ahead.
I hope Trey Draper's watching because they're better than IMG. They won the national championship in basketball and soccer. Great place. So I did grow up here. Went off to boarding school. Went off to college. Came back as an adult. So yeah, to your point, growing up as a kid, I watched the Memphis Tigers, Larry Finch, Keith Lee, Vincent Askew, Andre Turner is a good friend of mine, as he is you too, I know. Over the years, there were no Grizzlies. Right. So when I first walked in the Finch Center back then to work with Josh Pastor's team, I had to pinch myself. It was very special. I'm not saying not working with any team it's different though. Being your hometown team that you grew up with as a kid. Has some of the new car smell worn off? Yeah, not in a bad way, but like now it's work. Still love it. Right. It's still an honor. I absolutely love Penny Hardaway. He's a good friend. He's been good to me. It's still special to work with them though, definitely. It's not the normal, just okay. I'm going off to Idaho to work with a team today. It's a little bit different.
I get excited the same way. When we first started out, we had William Bedford, we had Andre Turner on here, guys that I watched in college, and I got a little starstruck too. But the more I got to talk to them, more that I learned who they were as a person. Then their story just became that much more special to me, just being able to do that. But it is special, and I love highlighting people in Memphis, especially obviously because I live here. But
but it's funny, like this when your hobby or your passion becomes your job over time. I don't want to say the passion diminishes, but it becomes the norm.
Yes, it does. It does.
So I found myself a couple of years ago. I was flying off somewhere. It was those early flights out of Memphis. You got to get up at like 4 a.m. and you're out by like 6 or 7. It's like I'm dragging a suitcase across the parking lot. It's freezing cold. It's dark, and I was complaining to my wife beforehand, and I'm like, oh man, I dread this. And she's like, look at you. Most guys or anyone would anything to do what you're doing right now to work with these teams and kind of put it in perspective a little bit,
Well, and I use that philosophy as well. I when I get tired or I don't want to do a podcast or I don't want to even go to a basketball game, like I'm just so tired, I also start thinking about I'm grateful I have this opportunity because I lived in Houston for 16 years. I could not go see a Memphis Tiger game except when they were there once a year. So I start thinking about how grateful I am for the opportunity that I have. It doesn't always work. I'm still tired sometimes, but I try to do that.
I agree. When we're tired, we get a little, and this is human nature, we all psychologically get a little bit worn down and cranky, and we fail to have that sort of attitude of gratitude. But then hopefully, and I know you do, if we have enough self-awareness, we can snap out of it and be like, you know what, this is cool. I want to do this. I'm, still a big soccer guy. So every week I try to go to the brass door. Seamus, I'm a big Arsenal fan.
I see your pictures there.
Oh, I love it. And then every now and then I'll be tired and I'll write to my wife because those Premier League games are in England, so they're 6 hours later there. So
Yes.
sometimes they're 6 in the morning here. Be like, I don't want to go. My wife was like, you always feel better when you go. Get out, go. And I do. It's like one of those things,
It
you
is.
know.
It is. So let's talk about your book, Slow Your Roll: Mindfulness for Fast Times. It how what prompted you to write the book? And
Yeah,
what was that process?
sort of on a base level or perfunctory level. I give a lot of presentations and do a lot of talks like you do.
Mhm.
And someone would always say, well, do you have a book? And then finally, I'm not the quickest learner. Finally, being a dog, you know what? I could probably make a little money and get some more gigs if I had a book.
Yeah.
But what I was saying too, being an English major and an old English teacher, I shudder to think about grading papers now. I just can't. It makes me sick thinking about that. But I always like writing. And I still like journal every day. I think you do too. You're a journaler, and I think you sell a really cool journal
I
too.
do. I do.
Um, it just it was a cathartic process for me, and I wanted to share sort of my teachings and stuff for my mindfulness in a book. And Will Wade, the coach that I talked about, the former LSU coach, who's now at McNeese State, one of my closest friends, wrote the foreword. A lot of basketball stuff in it. I'm not trying to plug it, but yes, I am.
But that
So I,
you're more than welcome. I'm going to plug it for you.
thank you. So I think your viewers and listeners definitely relate to it. There's some Grizzly stuff, some Tiger stuff in it. I think they'd enjoy it.
So, was it a hard I mean, obviously you have that background already writing, but did you self-publish or did you go through a publisher?
No, I went through a publisher, a guy named Timber Hawkeye, who wrote a bestseller years ago called Buddhist Boot Camp, really into mindfulness, published it for me. Um, it's a time consuming process. And I feel like we all live in this age of distraction and procrastination
Mm. Yeah, I
where
agree.
we're always pulled by some external stimulus, whether it's social media or the news or just whatever. It's like squirrel, we're all like that now.
Right.
Part of it is I'm getting older. I'm in my late 50s, but I wrote it in 2018, but there was some of that. It's definitely not an easy process. It's a humbling process to have editors and publishers take a pen to it and just rip it apart. It was good for me though. I've been trying to write, been dabbling on writing the second one for a while now. We'll see. We'll see if I get that done.
Do you have a title?
Yeah, so as you know, you and I are friends. I'm about to start going through some surgeries because of my running and soccer knees. I'm going to have my left hip replaced in
Oh,
December,
don't
then
envy
my
you.
Achilles worked on in the spring, and then my knees replaced one at a time. Probably be a process over the next 2 years. So into my head popped a title, the Art of Aging Mindfully. So, so let's see. My wife Holly gave me a $6 million man. I don't want to say doll, action
I
figure.
saw that
Uh,
on your social media.
yeah. So I'm going to be 20% titanium or porcelain, whatever it is. I was kind of toying around with that idea, but I'm going to keep waiting for some divine intervention. That might be it. So
That
we'll see.
that might be. So,
I don't want to force it. It's like that music artist that has that first song that ends up being I don't want to say a flute, but a hit
oh
out of
yeah.
nowhere, and then the second album is never good because it's forced. I don't want to do that. So
I will say that from a creative perspective, because I started off as a photographer, I kind of take that same concept. I will just let things just kind of marinate in my head, or I'll even put stuff up on the wall just to kind of, especially if I'm trying to think about a title or a concept or something, just so that I can see it routinely every day. And it's always subconscious, in my head. And that there'll be days where the light bulb will come on, and there'll be days where it's like the last moment. I remember one time I was shooting for the American Heart Association, and I was in Houston, and I had to do themes for the men. A lot of them were doctors, and I didn't want to shoot them as their job. So I created a theme, and it was usually about something that was like the essence of them. And there was this one guy, and his was science fiction. That's what he loved. He was a cardiologist, but I couldn't think of how to shoot him. Like I just couldn't. He liked to gamble on the games, but I couldn't do that. Like I didn't want to shoot him as a gambler. So I just kept thinking and thinking. And I was literally the day of the shoot, I'm like scrolling through Facebook, and the X-Files was coming up. They were rebooting it for like 6 episodes. And I saw it, and the light bulb came on, and I actually photographed him as Mulder. Like I took him,
Oh, cool.
yeah. And I found one of the ladies I know, she had a fake alien head, and they turned out to be the coolest pictures, and he just had a blast. So yeah, I let things marinate a little bit.
You've got to. And my publisher told me that before. He's a more experienced
Mm.
writer, but I rushed and tried to write the second book, and I looked at it, I'm like, this is terrible. This is absolutely terrible. I did a couple like that. So I've got a bunch of bits and scraps of writing and old journals and notebooks, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm gonna try to integrate some of that into this sort of new topic and see where it goes. I don't know. I'm not in any rush to do it, so we'll see. You
Mm.
know.
So you have worked over the years with a lot of different teams, with each of them, as you said, have their own cultures and their challenges. Are there any specific moments or success stories that stand out for you, and why did they work?
Yeah, basically, I see myself as a catalyst, not really as a healer, right? I'm
Mhm.
not like some special type person that's like sawing open their brain and putting magical stuff in it. Basically, if I can teach them these skills, it gives them, if I'm successful, and ultimately it's up to them. If they're successful, if they listen to it, I see myself almost like as a quarterback. I'll
Mm,
throw them the ball. If they
right.
can catch it and keep doing it and be consistent with the work, they're going to succeed. Part of it is the rapport. I've got to develop a good rapport with them. They've got to trust me. And for a lot of these guys, it's tough because everyone wants a piece of them. And it's been like that probably since middle school, where they first showed some great potential for basketball. And I'll talk about ones that have talked about it in the movie before. That way I'm
Yeah.
not going to betray confidence because it's already
Sure.
out there.
Sure.
One of the early ones with Memphis was Austin Nichols. Remember him?
Yes, I do.
Young player, came from Collierville High School. I think originally signed or had committed to Tennessee. Then he flipped and came to Memphis. Um, he had a lot of performance anxiety when he started at Memphis. And he kept saying things like, these guys in college are so much quicker and faster. We worked really hard together really his 2 years he was there, but really did it in a concentrated manner that first semester.
Mm.
And you could see big gains in his play from November to like February of his freshman year, where he really bought into it and practiced it and believed in it and ultimately cultivated self confidence. So when something like that happens, it's really rewarding.
So, what would you tell these athletes? Because there's only so many Steph Currys, right? So many LeBron Jameses. So, what would you tell these athletes who have only played professionally maybe a couple of years, and then they've been passed over, and now they're looking at, I've got to find a real job, so to speak, and I've got to transition into a different career. Every one of the athletes I've had on here has talked in depth about the mental aspect of, suddenly their job's been taken from them, and they don't believe they're good enough, and they don't feel like they have any other purpose, and they don't know what they're good at, and they feel all alone, and suddenly they're not the top of their game, so to speak. What Give me 3 tips, or give the people listening 3 tips on how they can kind of choose a different path for themselves mentally.
I can really give you one massive
Okay.
tip instead of three that might be
Excellent.
a difference maker. If I start working with them early enough, I try to stress upon them the importance of having multiple identities. That sounds a little bit crazy.
No, it doesn't.
What I'll do is I'll have them get a journal or a notebook out, and I'll ask them to write down 20 things about themselves. In other words, what 20 things are you? So inevitably, the first thing they'll write down is a basketball player. And then they'll struggle to find sometimes even 5 different things. The problem, I'll tell them, is if you solely identify with being a basketball player, one, what's going to happen when your career is over? What kind of life are you going to have? What kind of feelings of self-worth are you going to have if you solely judge yourself and your identity on only being a basketball player? What are you going to feel about yourself, or how are you going to feel about yourself if you have a bad game or a bad practice, or you blow your knee out and you can't play anymore? So they'll be like, but I'm nothing else. No, you're probably a son.
Yeah.
Depending on your religion, you're a Christian or whatever. You're an American. You like playing video games. You like reading. You like, name all the different things that you are. I'm a brother. I'm an uncle. And you're not a basketball player. You're a guy who plays basketball well. There's a subtle little difference with nuance there, too. So whenever they have a bad day, I'm like, go pull out your list. And essentially, if you can think about yourself and having a rich, full life with these multiple identities, when one of the things on the list, such as being a basketball player, doesn't go well, you don't spiral down, hopefully, into a depression.
Right.
You're like, okay, I still have a rich, full, good life. I didn't play well today, but maybe I'll play well tomorrow. The other thing I'll tell them is the only consistency in life is change.
Yes.
And from a mindfulness perspective, we're always trying to resist change or the great unknown or uncertainty. We cling and grasp. It's futile, though. I'm not saying you should like bad things that happen to you, but if you get into the habit of realizing that the only consistency in life is change, and life is always going to change, and see it as an adventure, instead of living and dying every time it changes, so to speak, you're going to be better off.
The ebbs and flows of life.
Without a doubt.
Yes.
You're going to have them. And I guess I'm giving you 3 now. The other is not to have a perfection mindset, have a growth mindset. Even Steph Curry's not perfect. He doesn't shoot 100%. Have a growth mindset, and a growth mindset sort of encapsulates, I'm going to continue to try to grow and get better. Mistakes and failure are part of the journey. I may not like them because I'm a competitor, but I'm going to be okay. I'm trying to get better every day. That's what a growth mindset is all about.
Okay, I think those are great for people because now let me ask you this, because what I have and I've pondered this question. You have an athlete, let's just say basketball for the sake of we're in Memphis. So you have a basketball player who has grown up giving 100% to learning the sport of basketball, how to be the best. And he gets to college and he's still wanting to be the best. How do you, or is it feasible that you've got a person who then, if they want to have life after college or after their pro career, they need to start thinking about the other parts of them, like you mentioned?
No, without a doubt. And it's about, I'm sorry, you're getting me excited with this great question.
But then is it possible for them to be such an elite athlete if they split their focus and start preparing for life after sports? Is it almost contradictory?
No, absolutely not. If anything, they're not going to burn out just myopically always hyper fixating on basketball.
Right.
They're going to get to the point where it's drudgery. It's coming in. It's like working in a rock quarry, having to hammer rocks for a living. They're going to end up absolutely hating it if that's all they think about. I'll tell my guys that I work with now, the Memphis guys and everybody else, sure the coaches don't like it, but it works. I'm like, have a little time every day where you're not thinking about basketball.
Well, sure.
Have your feet and your mind in the same place. If you're On the basketball court, think about basketball. If you're in the classroom, think about class. If you're in a social situation, think about the social situation. If anything, that's going to help your focus for when you play basketball. If you learn how to sort of monotask instead of multitask on one thing at a time.
Right.
I knew a kid, well, he's a young man now, he's playing professionally in the NBA, Skylar Mays. He was a pre-med student. You don't see that often.
No.
He had varied interest, really good at this stuff, at sort of having multiple identities and interest. And besides the fact he was really brilliant, but it's good to have varied interest.
You've worked, and you talk about this, you've worked a lot with Will Wade, who's now the coach at McNeese. Were you guys like, had you always been friends with him, or did that just come about as you started working?
I love Will Wade. Will Wade's like my brother. Josh was the first coach that I worked with, and then Trey Draper, who played on that first team that I worked with Josh Pastner. He was getting ready to go be a grad assistant for Will at Will's first head coaching job at UT Chat. He talked me up to Will. Will and I met, and we just immediately clicked. So I worked with him at Chattanooga, then VCU, then LSU, now McNeese. We used to run together when I had knees and hip. We did everything. It's one of those relationships where you just kind of click. I'm always very conscious, like working with coaches and teams, you don't ever want to get too close on a personal level with everyone.
It's true.
It's like that old saying, I'm not here to make friends. You can still be friendly, obviously,
right.
And you should be. But sometimes you just click with someone and you can't help it. And that's kind of, last night, McNeese almost knocked off number 2 Alabama.
Wow.
They weren't supposed to, obviously. So great coach, great human being. Got into a little bit of trouble. He has a growth mindset. He's learning from it. So,
and that's all we can ask of people is, to learn from whatever has happened and use that to fuel that, to push their journey forward, but also to help educate other people.
Without a doubt. And if I were to make a joke of it, I would say with NIL, he was a little bit ahead of the time. So there's that. Hope he doesn't see this, but it's kind of funny anyone.
Okay, let's talk about your podcast. So you started this podcast. It's called Live a Little with Pete Pranica, who's, as I said, who's also been a guest on here, episode 56. What sparked that idea? And if you guys have not listened, you need to listen. What sparked that idea? And how do you come up with the topics?
Yeah, Pete, as we all know, he's the television voice for the Memphis Grizzlies. He's done it for 20 years. I'm biased because he's one of my closest friends. He's the best in the business to me. He's got one of 30 really special jobs, right? In the NBA. He bought some podcast equipment a couple of years ago. I think he was going to do some podcasts for 901 FC, the soccer team here. And I think he wanted to get his money's worth. But also he wanted to do a thing, just two guys sitting down, having a beer, talking about just stuff, random stuff. It's not that it's not sports related. We'll talk about sports. We'll talk about the Grizzlies, the Tigers. We both are big Arsenal soccer fans. We'll talk about them. But we talk about everything. We just have a good time. We say we do it for ourselves. Maybe that's a selfish way to put it, but we love doing it. It's just an excuse for him and me to get together. Maybe once a week sometimes, more or less. It's typically twice a month if we're lucky with both of our travel schedules. Yeah. We love doing it. So
do you drink with every episode?
You can sound harsh. We sip a beer or two. Make it sound like we have an issue.
Well, I
wouldn't say I'm not a big drinker, but I'm more of a soccer guy. We drink a little more. If we're recording in the morning, typically we won't drink. But if we're recording in late afternoon or evening, we will each have one beer, is what we do.
So I was going to ask, though, do you pick a different beer each time if it is in the afternoon?
We try to, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So there's a great, I'm going to give them a shout out. Maybe they'll give us a discount. Uh, Yorkshire is the way that we say it, but I have a friend in England said I sounded dumb when I said it that way. I think it's Yorkshire is the way that they say it. Brinker is over there near Balmoral area, wherever
Yes.
sort of that is, kind of near where Pete, I don't want to say where Pete lives, but they have a great beer selection. So starting going there. Last week, I think we're on episode 38. We've been doing it about a year and a half. We had an Evil Knievel beer. You're too young to know who Evil Knievel is.
No, I'm not. I think I'm the same age as you.
I know, I'm just, we had an Evil Knievel beer, which was fun. We just,
I don't even know what to say to that.
not a great tasting beer, but just having Evil Knievel on this, striped American jumpsuit on a motorcycle in the can, I couldn't resist it. So it was made good fodder for the podcast.
I'm sure. I haven't listened to everyone. I do listen to the ones I'm mentioned in, which I got to tell you now. Every time I see my name pop up, I'm like, oh dear, what are they going to say today?
So we need to start mentioning you in every podcast so you listen to all of them, right? We need to do that.
Okay, so are we gonna are you gonna be recording in December with your surgeries?
My surgery, my left hip will be replaced December 13th, so probably not for a few weeks, but hopefully in early December. I never know. I'll text Pete, and he's so grouchy sometimes. I'm like, I'm in San Francisco because the Golden State Warriors. Why? I'm like, okay. I don't like. He's like, Google and see when the Grizzlies are playing. I'm like, all right, man, all right.
It's much easier to text him and ask.
Yeah, right. I'm like, I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking, Pete. So, and then I look on his social media. He was having like avocado toast in Colorado with his feet in the sand the day before a game. So, flying those private jets with the Grizzlies and staying at the 5-star hotels, I give him a hard time.
No,
he's got it rough.
It's a rough life, I tell you.
It really is. He and does well with what he does, but don't let him fool you. He's got some nice perks.
He does. Where can everybody listen to your podcast?
Yeah, it's on all podcast platforms, whether it's Apple or whatever else, Spotify, wherever you find podcast. And it's Live a Little with Pete Pranica and Greg Graber.
That's right. And I will have a link in the show notes and also on my Buzzsprout website for this podcast. I've got it linked at the bottom as a podcast I recommend. So
thank you.
You guys can do that out there. So let's go into just a few more things here. Do you, I think you've already kind of talked about this. Do you have how do you stay grounded and centered?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of different ways. I call them my anchors. And by the way, I work with private clients too, kind of one-on-one if anyone is ever interested. But sort of for me, it's daily meditation, even if it's only 10 minutes every morning.
Right.
I try to journal every day, at least during the work week. Sometimes on the weekends, I don't get that done. And I try to decompartmentalize. When I'm at home, I try not to think too much about work, which is hard with technology. Yes. Technology is kind of the Trojan workforce of the work world, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they sneak work in on us, giving us a laptop or a phone, whatever. I try not to do too much of that. I try to hang out with my wife, have a glass of wine, a good dinner, hang out with our 2 dogs and our cat, just anything that helps relieve stress and kind of puts me in a better place.
Okay, those are good. So thinking about your career path so far, what would you say has been the most rewarding or is the most rewarding part of your work?
Ooh, that's so tough. As you know, because you've had the composite career, you do have the composite career, you do several different things as well. It's hard. I would say probably having a positive impact on people. Yeah. Couple things came to mind. This week, I got a text from an SEC kicker. Didn't have a great game 2 weeks ago. This week, he hit, I think it was 3 or 4 field goals in a row. He sends me a text of him in his SEC team uniform, meditating or breathing in the locker room. Said it worked. I heard from a soccer player, Division I soccer player in North Carolina who went through a rough patch last year as a junior. This year as a senior, he made all conference, made me feel really good. Little things like that, you
Yeah.
know.
When you look back on everything, the education, the coaching, the writing, the podcasting now, what's the legacy that you hope to leave in the world of sports and mental performance?
Uh, that I help people, one, believe in themselves, and two, reach their potential. I feel like that's important, you know. I think for us to believe in ourselves, we have to know that someone else believes in us first.
Right.
And I always want to be that person.
I know what I was going to say. So, Simone Biles,
Mhm.
from the previous Olympics, which I think was Tokyo, and then the Paris Olympics, and just the conversation around, mental health. Do you think that her story unfolding internationally has helped people buy into what you are, I hate to use the word selling, but to what you do?
Yeah, not just her, even, but yes, without a doubt. But also, like, remember Kevin Love a few years ago
Yes,
came
yes.
out, talked about depression. Um, LeBron is, I don't know if he's an investor or an owner, but he advertises the Calm,
Mm-hmm.
CALM,
Yeah.
mindfulness app.
Yes.
There's all kinds of things. Kobe, arguably one of the best, not arguably the best basketball player, but one of the best basketball players at the very least ever, was really into mindfulness and stuff. Whenever I go into work with a team nowadays, I can show them YouTube clips of Steph Curry,
Mm.
LeBron, Kobe, all these guys talking about Jamal Murray, all these guys talking about mental game, mindfulness, mental performance, mental health, all this kind of stuff. Back in the early days, you didn't find any of that, or not much of it, you know. And to a certain extent, back in the old days, it was seen mistakenly as a weakness.
Yes.
Like, you're just mentally weak. There's nothing wrong with you. No, that's not true, you know. So
It
it's
was
interesting.
it for us. Our second episode was with William Bedford, and his to me was the most eye opening because in it he talked about when he got to Memphis. I mean, he grew up here, but when he started playing at Memphis and playing in the Mid South Coliseum, he talked about how he just couldn't get on the court without getting high. And he was very open
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
And after, seeing his entire story fold out, I told him, I said, or I asked him, I said, what you had obviously was anxiety. Like you could not get on the court at all. You need something to calm down. No one recognized that. And I think even if they did, they probably would not have felt the need to do anything about that other than just telling him to.
Oh, without a doubt. Now, like at the University of Memphis, they have a cadre of like mental health professionals on staff.
Yes.
They
Yes.
have clinical counselors. They have many different. Back then, that was 1982, 84,
Yeah.
around there. I remember my teenage years. Yeah, I'm sure they didn't have a sports psychologist on staff,
No.
I would say.
No. And,
Um,
and just
it's different.
and the trajectory of his career, if that had been something that was talked about and he could have had the resources to deal with that, his life may have been different,
Yeah, oh,
going
without a
forward.
doubt. Like he was 7 feet tall and
Yeah.
just could have had a long NBA career if they had the resources that they
Right.
do now. It's funny. I went in and had a conversation with Tubby Smith, who ended up being really nice to me. So when Josh Pastner left, a lot of his players kept going to Tubby and saying, "We want to still work with Greg." He had no idea who Greg was.
Right.
When he went to the secretary, they got my number, called me, he had me come in. He starts chastising me at first. Like, you're telling these guys to come talk to, I'm like, I haven't told anybody anything. He's like, well, what do you do? And I'm like, well, these guys have a lot of stress. And he stopped. He goes, these guys don't have any stress. being the stress is like my dad being in World War II and blah, blah, blah. It just went on and on and on. We ended up having a really nice relationship. I didn't really work with his team. He was a nice guy. He'd
Right.
always speak to me, come up and hug me and stuff. But like sort of that old school generation where Tubby was,
Right.
they didn't understand this type of stuff.
No, and after my interview with William, I went and talked to Joey Dorsey. He was working with the staff at that time. And I asked him just off the cuff, I'm like, did you have any type of focus issues or anxiety when you played in college? And he's like, oh my God, yes. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, I would have somebody braid and unbraid my hair
Oh wow.
before the game. And he
Yeah.
said, just something about that helped me focus and helped me, prepare myself. And I found that very interesting. And so that was another conversation about, because, a lot of my guests have talked about the mental aspect, and that's one of the reasons we started this. And now
Yeah, typically, so they'll bring me in and they'll be like, you need to especially work with this player, this player, this player. I'm not talking about Memphis, just teams in
right,
general.
right.
And whenever I have found the ones that need it the most initially resist it the most, which makes sense.
Does.
Um, so
What do you work with high school students?
I do. I do. I work with some of the teams here at Lausanne, but I also work with individuals throughout the city. Typically, that'll be in person
Right.
or throughout the country on Zoom or FaceTime.
Do you find that the high school students have a harder time buying into the topic because they don't want to look weak to their friends?
Typically, their friends won't know that they're doing it because they're just having a session with me once a week
Right.
on FaceTime or whatever. But I find that once a kid or a young adult has made it to college, especially like a strong D1 program like a Memphis or a Marquette or LSU or VCU, they're going to be more serious about everything that'll make them better.
Right.
And and they have so much pressure. It's not only they put pressure on themselves to do well, which is human nature, doesn't mean they're weak or something's wrong with them. They have goals.
Right.
They're competitors. But then the coaches put pressure on them, the fans and the media. And as you see, social media can be brutal. Then they have their handlers. Some of them, it's their former AAU coaches,
Right.
or they have an uncle. Someone's always in their ear telling them they're in the wrong position, or they're not getting enough minutes, or whatever. The coach is messed up. So there's so much internal and external noise. It's incredible. Anyone that thinks that these are all pampered athletes who have no pressure. Granted, some of them may make NIL money, make $100,000 or even more, but that doesn't take all those issues away.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't take any of those mental issues away. It may help them buy their food, feed their
Yeah,
family, but it doesn't take, to me, I would think it kind of adds more pressure onto it.
I agree.
Then,
And we live in this culture of instant gratification with
yes.
Uber Eats and Netflix and whatever. We get what we want when we want it, whenever, with the push of a button.
Right.
So I see kids now on some teams I'll be working with, and it'll be December. The season starts in November. It's like, I'm not coming back to this school next year. I'm transferring.
Yeah.
I'm not getting my minutes. I'm like, the season just started. Why don't we work on this and you just try?
Yeah.
It's amazing how everything is about instant gratification now. And that's not a judgment or an indictment on the kids.
No.
Society puts that on them pretty much.
I was just talking with someone about that yesterday, about the issue of instant gratification for kids of all ages, and even for adults, it's all there, and no one they don't people don't necessarily cultivate patience anymore.
Oh yeah, my parents would never let me quit anything. There
Me
was a team or
neither.
two. There was a team or two I was on. I had to see through the season. I was miserable. And it was a great lesson in perseverance and grit and tenacity. I mean, obviously, if someone is being abused, that's a different story. But if it's just me not getting what I want to out of it, then I need to stick with it.
Recently I had two guests on, Cameron Kinley, didn't he go to Lausanne? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Cameron. I worked with Cameron at Lausanne, and then when he was a Navy football
Yes.
player. Yeah.
So I had two guys, he and another guy. He played football, obviously, for the Naval Academy, and the other guy, Grant, played basketball. Two fascinating episodes if anyone wants to go check those out. But both of them talked about the mental aspect of being in the Naval Academy and just how difficult it was. And, obviously they've got people there to help everybody going through it because it's obviously a rude awakening for everybody. But I found, that very eye-opening as well, just the amount of stress and the amount that you have to learn to focus and just kind of concentrate on everything. um Greg, any last comments to everybody out there listening?
No, I've had a great time. If anyone ever wants to get in touch with me about anything, I'm
Yes.
not even plugging business. I'll help you out. I'll shoot you an email, give you some advice, whether you want it or not. My email is info@greggraber.com. And my website, which is a listing of everything that I do, is greggraber.com.
Excellent. I'll put that all in the show notes as well. Any social media platform you'd like people to follow you on?
I'm on Twitter. I'm trying not to check it too much. Uh, at Greg Graber,
Okay.
getting on that.
Uh,
So
I'll do that as well. Okay, Greg, thank you so much for being on the show today.
I enjoyed it so much. Great to see you.
You as well. Thank you all for listening, especially if you've made it all the way to this part of the show. I appreciate all of your support. Another reminder to subscribe to the show wherever you listen or watch. My mantra is like, share, and review. Follow us on social media at 5TH Quarter or 5THQRT Podcast. And remember, we're now every other week for episodes every other Wednesday. Until next time, remember, change is our ally and it paves the way for greatness. Stay inspired. Have a great rest of the week.